Thunder rattles the reinforced foundation of a fortress hidden beneath the Chicago skyline, but the real storm is inside. A $15 billion empire is hemorrhaging. Assets are evaporating from the digital ledger, line by line, like a pulse flattening on a heart monitor. They call it the phantom leak, a silent, invisible thief stripping Neil Ramirez of everything he has bled for. 50 stories up, 20 of the highest-paid cybersecurity experts in the country are sweating through their silk shirts, paralyzed. Neil doesn't scream. He doesn't break the glass. He stands in the center of the command hub, a predator watching his territory burn to the ground in a terrifying, calculated silence. The heavy security doors hiss open, a mechanical intrusion into a room thick with the scent of ozone and desperation. Marisol Maloney stumbles in, her delivery uniform slick with rain and her boots squeaking against the polished marble. She looks small, a gig worker holding a thermal bag of lukewarm steak, an accidental witness to a king's execution. She's exhausted. She's been blacklisted, broken, and forced to trade her genius for tips from people who don't know her name. But as she looks up and sees the flickering sequence on the master console, the specific, rhythmic stutter of the cooling system's firmware, the weariness leaves her eyes. While the experts scramble to build firewalls against a ghost, Marisol sees the physical rot. She doesn't see a hack, she sees a prophecy she made years ago finally coming true. Amidst the frantic shouting of men with guns and PhDs, her voice cuts through the chaos like a blade. You aren't being hacked. You're being liquidated by your own hardware. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm responding to everyone. Click subscribe, like this video. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them. Now let's begin. The sky over Chicago was the color of a bruised lung, pouring a relentless, icy deluge that turned the streets into a blurred mirror of neon and steel. Marisol Maloney adjusted the strap of her delivery bag, her fingers numb against the thermal lining. She shouldn't have taken this order. The address was a fortress, a sprawling estate tucked behind iron gates that didn't appear on standard GPS. But the tip was $100, and in a world that had erased her name, Marisol couldn't afford the luxury of suspicion. She was ushered through 3 security checkpoints, each more invasive than the last. By the time she reached the inner sanctum, she was shivering, her cheap polyester jacket clinging to her skin. The air inside the command center was different, it tasted of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of overheating processors. It was a room where fortunes were managed, but tonight, it felt like a funeral parlor. Men in tailored black suits stood frozen behind glowing workstations, their faces illuminated by the frantic strobing of crimson error codes. In the center of the chaos stood Neil Ramirez. He was a pillar of terrifying stillness, his dark eyes fixed on a massive central monitor where a $15 billion empire was being systematically dismantled. Every few seconds, a digital ledger refreshed, and another several $1 million vanished into the ether. Find the entry point. Neil's head of security roared, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who knew his life depended on the next 5 minutes. Reroute the traffic. Isolate the node. Marisol stood by the door, her presence ignored, her thermal bag of steak and potatoes feeling absurdly heavy. She looked at the screens, not with the panic of the men in the room, but with the weary recognition of a scholar reading a familiar text. The data wasn't being redirected by a malicious actor, it was being corrupted. She watched the way the packets stuttered, the specific, jagged rhythm of the system's failure. It wasn't a hack. It was a ghost she had hunted years ago. She dropped the thermal bag on a nearby console, the thud drawing the sharp, lethal gaze of a dozen armed guards. Neil turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the wet, shivering girl who had dared to interrupt the end of his world. Marisol didn't flinch. She pointed a trembling, calloused finger at the master server rack, specifically the blinking amber light on the secondary cooling firmware. You're wasting your time looking at the firewall, she said, her voice steady despite the cold. It's a thermal throttling cascade in the firmware. Your RAID controller is misinterpreting the heat spike as a data wipe command. The room went silent. Neil stepped toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. And who the hell are you? The person who wrote the white paper on why that specific hardware was a ticking time bomb, Marisol replied, meeting his gaze. You aren't being raided, Mr. Ramirez. Your empire is just melting from the inside out. The silence that followed Marisol's declaration was heavier than the thunder outside. It was the kind of silence that preceded a gunshot or a prayer. Neil Ramirez didn't move, he simply studied her, his gaze a physical weight that seemed to strip away her rain-soaked uniform and the exhaustion of the last 3 years, searching for the lie. He looked at her not as a delivery girl, but as a sudden, impossible variable in an equation of total ruin. Out, Neil said. The word was barely a whisper, yet it carried the force of a command from a god. His head of security stammered, his hand hovering near his holster. Sir, she's a witness. We don't know who she's working for. Out. All of you. Neil's eyes never left Marisol's. If she's lying, she dies in 5 minutes when the servers melt. If you stay, you die in 10 for failing me. Choose. The room cleared in a frantic, muffled scramble of footsteps. The heavy doors hissed shut, sealing them in a tomb of humming machines and flickering red light. Now, there was only the King of Chicago and the girl who claimed to see what his experts could not. Neil reached into the shadow of his desk and produced a sleek, matte black semi-automatic. He didn't point it at her chest, he laid it on the console right next to her hand, the metal clicking against the glass. Fix it, he commanded, his voice a low, melodic growl. Or pick up the gun and save me the trouble of doing it myself. Marisol looked at the weapon, then at him. The predatory intensity in his expression would have broken a lesser person, but Marisol had already been destroyed by the corporate world, she had nothing left to fear but the loss of her mind. She pulled out a chair, the wheels screeching against the floor, and sat. I need your root access, she said, her fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. And I need you to stop breathing down my neck. You're increasing the ambient temperature of the room, and that's the last thing these processors need. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or a deadly curiosity, passed through Neil's eyes. He stepped back, crossing his arms, watching as Marisol's fingers began to fly. She didn't look at the gun again. She was back in the matrix, her mind weaving through the architecture of the firmware failure. She bypassed the security layers his team had spent hours trying to bolster, diving straight into the cooling system's kernel. The firmware was designed to fail under high-frequency trading loads, she muttered, more to herself than him. It's a kill switch disguised as a glitch. Who put it there? Neil asked, his voice right behind her ear. The people who sold it to you, Marisol whispered, hitting a final, decisive key. The people who thought you were too stupid to notice. The screaming fans in the server racks began to drop in pitch, shifting from a frantic whine to a steady, rhythmic hum. The red error codes on the monitors blinked once, twice, and then vanished, replaced by the cool, steady blue of a stabilized system. The bleeding had stopped. Marisol exhaled, her shoulders finally dropping, as the $15 billion empire sat dormant and safe at her fingertips. She turned the chair to face him. Neil was looking at the screen, then back at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he reached for her chin, tilting her head back so she had no choice but to drown in the dark intensity of his stare. You're not a delivery girl, he murmured, his thumb brushing against her jawline. You're a ghost. And I think I've just found my new architect. The blue light of the monitors reflected in Marisol's eyes, turning her iris to cold flint. She didn't look at the clock, but she felt the weight of the night pressing against the fortress walls. The immediate crisis had passed, the bleeding stopped, but the system was still fragile, a digital patient in a coma. To fully stabilize the network, she had to peel back the layers of the OS, tunneling into the encrypted purchase logs and the deep-seated hardware IDs that governed the syndicate's global traffic. Neil remained in the room, a silent sentinel in the shadows. He didn't pace, he simply watched her work, his presence a heavy, electric hum that kept her nerves on edge. Every time her fingers danced across the keys to reroute a data packet, she felt his eyes tracking the movement. He wasn't just watching her save his money, he was evaluating the precision of her mind. As she bypassed the final encryption layer of the hardware's manifest, a string of hexadecimal code flickered across the screen. Marisol froze. Her breath hitched in her throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She recognized the signature. It wasn't just a generic manufacturer's mark, it was a proprietary encryption handshake, a digital fingerprint she had helped develop 4 years ago at Ether Dynamics. Something's wrong, Neil noticed instantly, his voice slicing through her concentration. Not wrong, Marisol whispered, her voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and realization. Just, intentional. She pulled up the procurement history, digging through the shell companies Neil had used to buy the servers. On the other end of the transaction sat a ghost. But Marisol knew how to hunt ghosts. She traced the wire transfers back through a labyrinth of offshore accounts until she hit the source, Julian Vane. Her former CEO. The man who had stood in a mahogany-paneled office and told her she was too ambitious for her own good before framing her for the very security breach she had tried to prevent. Julian Vane sold you this gear, she said, turning to Neil. The monitor's glow cast sharp, skeletal shadows across her face. He didn't just sell you faulty hardware. He sold you a backdoor. The glitch I just fixed. It wasn't meant to trigger for another year. He was waiting for your empire to reach its peak before he flipped the switch and absorbed your liquidity into Ether's private accounts. Neil stepped into the light, his face hardening into a mask of pure, murderous intent. The realization that he, the man who ruled Chicago through fear and foresight, had been played like a novice by a corporate suit brought a chilling stillness to the air. Vane used me to test his kill switch, Marisol continued, her heart hammering against her ribs. And he used you to fund his expansion. He's the reason I'm wearing this uniform, and he's the reason your throne almost turned to ash tonight. Neil reached out, his hand hovering over the keyboard, his eyes locked on the name Vane pulsing on the screen. It seems we have a common enemy, Marisol. And it seems Julian Vane made a fatal mistake. He looked down at her, a dark, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He left his weapon in my living room. The final command line executed with a soft, definitive chime that felt like a gunshot in the cavernous room. Across the sprawling array of monitors, the jagged red lines smoothed into a steady, rhythmic pulse of emerald green. The phantom leak was plugged. The $15 billion that had been vaporizing into the digital void settled back into the syndicate's encrypted vaults, locked behind a new architecture Marisol had built on the fly, a labyrinth of her own design that Julian Vane's backdoors could never penetrate. Marisol leaned back in the ergonomic chair, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the night finally receding, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Her hands, still stained with the grime of the city streets, shook as she reached for her rain-slicked jacket. She had done it. She had saved the king, and now all she wanted was to disappear back into the anonymity of the Chicago rain, $100 tip in her pocket and her secret still intact. The system is isolated, she said, her voice raspy. I've rerouted the core logic. Vane is locked out. You're safe. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and began to walk toward the exit. She didn't get 5 steps before the heavy thud of the security bolts echoed through the room. The doors didn't budge. Neil Ramirez moved with the fluid, silent grace of a leopard. He didn't block her path so much as he reclaimed the space around her. He didn't look like a man who had just narrowly avoided financial execution, he looked like a man who had just discovered a diamond in a pile of glass. He reached out, his fingers catching the strap of her delivery bag, gently but firmly sliding it off her shoulder. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Safe is a temporary state, Marisol, he murmured, stepping into her personal space until she could smell the expensive tobacco and the cold, sharp scent of power clinging to his suit. You've shown me a vulnerability I didn't know I had. And more importantly, you've shown me the only person capable of fixing it. I'm a delivery girl, Mr. Ramirez, she whispered, her back pressing against the cold edge of a server rack. You have my name. You have the fix. Let me go. Neil tilted his head, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face with a terrifying intensity. It wasn't lust, not yet, it was the look of a collector who had stumbled upon a masterpiece in a basement. He reached out, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, tilting her face upward. "You were a delivery girl an hour ago," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. "Now, you are the most valuable asset in this city. Do you really think I'd let you walk back out into the rain so Julian Vane can find you? So the system that broke you can finish the job?" He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her ear. "The world thinks you're a ghost, Marisol. Stay a ghost. My ghost. I'll give you the resources to burn Vane's world to the ground, but you don't leave this fortress. You don't belong to the streets anymore. You belong to the architecture." He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply signaled the guards outside, his gaze never leaving hers. "Take her to the East Suite. Burn the uniform. Get her whatever she needs. She's staying." The transition from the hum of the server room to the silence of the East Suite was so absolute it felt like a physical weight. When Marisol finally opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed wasn't the view, but the lack of noise. There was no sirens wailing outside a cramped studio apartment, no rattling of a radiator, and no rhythmic drumming of rain on a rusted delivery bike. Instead, there was only the soft, expensive purr of climate control and the scent of white tea and cedar. She was lying on a bed that felt like a cloud, wrapped in silk sheets that cost more than she had earned in the last 3 years combined. For a disorienting second, she thought she was back in her old life, before the frame-up, a successful executive waking up from a fever dream of poverty. But then she saw the scarred knuckles of her own hands resting against the pristine fabric, and the memory of Neil Ramirez's dark, possessive gaze flooded back. She sat up, her body aching with the ghost of yesterday's labor. On a mahogany valet stand sat a collection of clothes that had been curated with surgical precision, cashmere sweaters in charcoal, tailored trousers, and a pair of Italian leather boots. Her old delivery uniform, the yellow polyester stained with road salt and grease, was gone. There was no trace of the girl who had arrived with a bag of lukewarm steak. Marisol walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The Chicago skyline was laid out before her like a circuit board, the gray morning light filtering through the clouds. She pressed her hand against the glass. It didn't vibrate. It was thick, reinforced, and likely bulletproof. Below, in the courtyard, she saw men in black suits patrolling the perimeter with the disciplined stillness of predators. This wasn't a guest room, it was a high-end containment unit. A soft chime echoed through the suite, and a sleek tablet on the nightstand flickered to life. It displayed a single message in a minimalist font: "Breakfast is served. Your new workstation is being calibrated. You have 3 hours until our first briefing." Marisol looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. She looked like the woman she used to be, polished, sharp, intellectual, but the eyes staring back were different. They were harder. She realized then that Neil hadn't just saved her from the rain, he had harvested her. The gig economy was a cage of desperation, but this was a velvet prison. Out there, she was a ghost who didn't matter. In here, she was the ghost architect of a criminal empire. She reached for the cashmere sweater, the fabric soft and treacherous against her skin. The delivery girl was dead. She had been liquidated by the very system she had tried to fix, and now, she was going to use the king's resources to ensure that when she finally burned the world down, she was the only one left standing in the ashes. The dining room was a cathedral of glass and shadow, illuminated only by the flicker of a dozen wax candles that cast long, dancing silhouettes against the walls. A table of hand-carved obsidian separated Marisol from Neil, the surface so polished it reflected their faces like a dark mirror. The meal was a masterpiece of precision, rare wagyu and vintage wine, but neither of them touched the silver. The air between them was saturated with something sharper than hunger, recognition. Neil sat at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of his black shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He watched Marisol navigate the silence with a poise that hadn't been bought with the cashmere she wore, it was innate. "Most people in your position would be asking about the morality of what I do," Neil said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the table. They would be counting the bodies or the kilograms. But you haven't asked a single question about the blood. Why? Marisol swirled the wine in her glass, watching the deep crimson liquid coat the crystal. Morality is a luxury for people who haven't been discarded by the system, she replied, her voice cool and devoid of sentiment. I spent years playing by the rules of good people, and they used those very rules to bury me. Logic is the only thing that doesn't lie. A system either works or it doesn't. Your system was broken. I fixed it. The why behind the data is irrelevant to the math. Neil leaned forward, the candlelight catching the lethal spark in his eyes. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. Logic over sentiment. Efficiency over empathy. You see the world as a series of vectors, don't you, Marisol? You don't care who the lion kills, as long as the hunt is perfectly executed. I care about the architect, Marisol corrected, meeting his gaze without blinking. I care about the person who builds something that can't be torn down. Julian Vane thought he was an architect, but he was just a parasite. He was sloppy. He let his ego create a backdoor that I could see. That's the real sin. Not the theft. The incompetence. Neil reached across the table, his fingers grazing the obsidian surface near hers. For the first time, the tension in the room shifted from the threat of violence to the threat of intimacy. They were two of a kind, predators who lived in the cold, binary spaces between right and wrong. We are the same, Neil murmured, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial silk. The world discarded us because we see the gears behind the curtain. They fear the logic we use to survive. He paused, his thumb tracing a slow circle on the table. I didn't bring you here just to fix a server, Marisol. I brought you here because I've been looking for a mirror. And I think I finally found one. The intellectual bond snapped into place, a dark, soul-binding contract written in the silent language of the code they both worshipped. Marisol felt the danger of it, the way his darkness called to the void inside her, and for the first time since the rain, she didn't want to run. The storm outside had returned, but it was no longer the rhythmic weeping of the Chicago rain, it was the sharp, percussive crack of high-caliber rounds shattering the peace of the estate. Marisol was in the command center, her fingers moving across a holographic interface that monitored the perimeter, when the first proximity alarm screamed. On the monitors, she didn't see the disorganized rush of a rival gang. She saw the synchronized, tactical precision of a Tier 1 cleaner team, Ether Dynamics shadow assets. Julian Vane wasn't coming to negotiate, he was coming to delete the evidence of his failure. The heavy steel doors of the hub hissed open, and Neil stepped in, his movements calm despite the muffled explosions echoing from the courtyard. He didn't look at the screens, he looked at Marisol. He saw the way her face paled as she recognized the tactical insignias on the attacker's gear. She knew exactly who was outside. She knew the names of the men sent to kill her. They're here for me, she whispered, her voice tight with a sudden, suffocating guilt. Vane won't stop until I'm a ghost for real. Neil reached her in 3 long strides, his hand coming down firmly on her shoulder. They aren't here for a delivery girl, Marisol. They're trespassing on my property to steal my architect. He turned to his head of security, who was waiting for the word. Full executive protection. No survivors. Show them that in this city, corporate interests die at my gates. Through the security cameras, Marisol watched a ballet of violence she had only ever seen in films. Neil's men weren't just guards, they were a private army, and they fought with a terrifying, fanatical loyalty. They moved through the gardens and corridors like shadows, intercepting the cleaners with a brutality that turned the estate's marble floors red. She watched as the man who had framed her years ago, Vane's lead security consultant, was pinned in the crosshairs of a syndicate sniper. She felt a strange, cold surge of triumph. For years, these people had been the architects of her misery, untouchable behind their NDAs and legal teams. Now, they were being hunted in the dark by a power they couldn't bribe. As the last of the breach team was neutralized, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Neil didn't move his hand from her shoulder. He stood with her, watching the cleanup crews move in to erase the mess. The message was unmistakable: she was no longer an outsider or a captive. She was the core of the hive, and the hive would bleed to keep her. "The debt is settled," Neil murmured, his voice vibrating against her ear. "They can't touch you now. You aren't just an asset, Marisol. You're the crown jewel. And Julian Vane just signed his own death warrant by trying to take what belongs to me." Marisol looked at the screens, then at the man beside her. The fear was gone, replaced by a dark, shimmering resolve. She wasn't just safe, she was weaponized. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air, a sharp, acrid reminder of the failed coup outside. Neil led Marisol back into the sanctuary of his private study, a room where the walls were lined with leather-bound books and the windows were shielded by heavy velvet. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, the ice clinking like a countdown in the sudden stillness. He didn't offer her a seat. He stood before her, the firelight casting half of his face into shadow, making him look like a god carved from obsidian. "The cleaners failed because they fought for a paycheck," Neil said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "My men fought for a king. There is a difference in the quality of the blood spilled." He handed her a glass, his fingers lingering against hers. "But Vane will try again. He will use the law, he will use the blacklists, and he will use the very digital shackles he locked you in 3 years ago." He walked to his desk and tapped a sequence into a concealed keypad. A single document appeared on the central display, a comprehensive dossier of Marisol's crimes. The sabotage charges, the fraudulent transfers, the fabricated ethics violations that had turned her into a pariah. With a flick of his wrist, he opened a secondary window, the private home addresses, offshore accounts, and encrypted mistress folders of every board member at Ether Dynamics. "I can make this disappear," Neil murmured, stepping into her space until the heat of him was all she could feel. "Not just hidden, but erased. I have the keys to the servers that govern the history of this country. I can give you back your name. I can make you a saint in the eyes of the system that burned you." Marisol looked at the faces of the men who had destroyed her, now laid bare and vulnerable on the screen. The urge for justice was a dull ache, the urge for vengeance was a living, breathing thing. "But I don't want a saint," Neil continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want the ghost architect. I want the mind that sees the world in vectors. Stay with me, Marisol. Total digital devotion. You build the walls of my empire so high that no god or government can scale them. In return, I will give you their heads. I will let you be the one to press the key that liquidates Ether Dynamics. I will give you the power to rule the future instead of hiding from the past." He held out a hand, palm up. It wasn't a request, it was a pact. A contract written in shadows and sealed with the promise of absolute retribution. Your life as a delivery girl ended the moment you saw that firmware glitch. This is the only life left for someone like you. Become my queen of the code, and we will turn this city into our private circuit board. Marisol looked at his hand, then at the digital ruins of her enemies. The logic was undeniable. The morality was dead. She placed her hand in his, her fingers steady, as the last of her hesitation evaporated like mist. The transformation was complete, not with a roar, but with the soft, rhythmic clicking of a mechanical keyboard in a room that had become Marisol's universe. The transition from the rain-slicked streets of Chicago to the throne of the city's most sophisticated digital fortress was final. The East Suite was no longer a velvet prison, it was the seat of a new kind of power. Marisol stood before the massive crystalline monitors of the command center, her silhouette sharp against the glow of 1,000 flowing data streams. She was no longer wearing the weight of a world that had discarded her. She wore the silence of a woman who had mastered the machine. Neil stood behind her, his presence no longer a threat, but an anchor. He watched as her fingers flew across the console, executing commands with a surgical elegance that his previous team could never have conceptualized. She wasn't just managing his assets, she was rewriting the very DNA of the syndicate's operations. Under her guidance, the Phantom leak had been weaponized. The same hardware flaw that Julian Vane had intended to use as a kill switch had been inverted. It was now a siphon, a silent vacuum that Marisol had attached to Ether Dynamics' internal infrastructure. "Are you ready?" Neil asked, his voice low and expectant. He leaned over her shoulder, his hand resting on the back of her chair, the king acknowledging the architect. Marisol didn't hesitate. "I've been ready for 3 years," she whispered. With a single, decisive keystroke, she initiated the hot swap. Across the screen, the logo of Ether Dynamics appeared, pulsing in a sickly corporate blue before it began to fracture. Marisol watched with cold, clinical detachment as her code tore through Vane's firewalls. She wasn't just stealing his money, she was erasing his legacy. She watched as his private communications were decrypted and leaked to every federal agency on the continent. She watched as the shell companies he had used to frame her were liquidated, their funds diverted into Neil's untraceable offshore accounts. In the corner of the screen, a live feed from Vane's penthouse office flickered to life. The man who had once looked down at her from a mahogany desk was now staring at a monitor in frozen horror, his empire collapsing in real time. He looked for a ghost in the machine, a hacker to bargain with, a breach to patch. He had no idea that the girl who used to bring him coffee and catch his glitches was now the one pulling the trigger from the heart of a mafia stronghold. "He's looking for the exit," Marisol murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "But I've already rewritten the locks." The command center hummed with the sheer volume of data being processed. Neil's global financial network was no longer just a collection of illicit accounts, it was a living, breathing organism, protected by Marisol's ghost architecture. She had built a fortress within a fortress, a digital sanctuary where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. As the final sector of Ether Dynamics went dark, the monitors returned to the cool, steady emerald pulse of Neil's empire. The silence returned to the room, but it was different now. It was the silence of a mission accomplished. Marisol leaned back in her chair, the light of the screens reflecting in her eyes like a crown of cold fire. She was no longer delivering food to the powerful. She was delivering the world to the man beside her, and in doing so, she had claimed her own throne. The girl who had stumbled in from the rain was gone. In her place sat the ghost architect, the woman who held the keys to the city's secrets, the silent partner to a predator, and the most dangerous mind in Chicago. Neil reached down, his fingers brushing the back of her neck before settling on her shoulder. "The city is ours, Marisol," he whispered. She didn't turn around. She simply watched the data flow, watching the world move according to the logic she had created. "No, Neil," she corrected softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon of code. "The city is mine. You just happen to be the one holding the sword." The lion's gaze met the architect's reflection in the glass, and for the first time, the predator knew he had finally met his match. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe.